Thank you so much, Michael and Dr. Dominguez. It's great to have you here, and it's wonderful to look out on this crowd and see faces who I know or have seen or over the years in my own schooling, some of which was homeschooling, some of which was the great Christian school that our kids went to, Trinity at Meadowview, which had a classical curriculum. At some point they were in Catholic schools as well, but just to see threads of it all coming together here. So it's wonderful to be here, and I want to emphasize one point from the outset, and that's that I truly believe that Catholic education is the single most important thing that our church needs to undertake right now. That there's so much discussion about the need for reform in our church, and certainly there are problems in many areas. But if we don't get Catholic education right, we don't have a future. We will lose our future. I'm aging, so. But the future that depends on Catholic education, the next generation, is showing signs of trouble. So you're probably familiar with some of these stats from the Pew surveys. For every one Catholic convert person coming into the church, 6 leave the faith. It used to be about 20 years ago that about 1 out of 4 Americans were Roman Catholic. That number is down to a little less than 1 in 5, just under 20%. But the numbers are worse when you look at young people. When we look at the millennial generation, which is really the generation that right now is becoming parents. They're not in school, they're just out of school, and they're becoming parents. Among millennials, only 16% are Catholic. Nearly 1/3 of millennials are atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated. So 2-to-1 odds. We haven't experienced that before as a church. Again, these are the future parents. And it would be one thing if all those millennials, that 16%, were fully practicing the faith and transmitting the faith to their children. But we know that's not the case. In fact, there's been some interesting research. CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, did some research comparing graduates of public education with graduates of Catholic schools. And what they found among the millennial generation was that those who had gone K through 12, all the way through public education, by the time they were adults, only 5% of them continued to attend Mass weekly. 5%. I wonder if their parents would have made a different decision if they knew that the odds were that 95% of them would not commit fully to the faith as the result of their public education. So how do Catholic schools fare? Better. Catholic education of all sorts, it was a pooled survey, among millennials as adults, 39% of those who attended Catholic school all the way along continue to attend Mass weekly. So it's better, definitely better. But we have to worry about the 60% who don't. And certainly among those numbers, there are some who attend Mass maybe a couple of times a month. But as I look at the statistics and the trends, those who are not attending Mass weekly are typically on their way out. They're not on their way in. So these are sobering numbers. And that's the millennial generation, as I said, the people who are becoming young parents right now. Generation Z, the kids who are in school now, those numbers are going to be worse. I can tell you just from the trends that we're seeing. So the future of the church looks really bleak. Why? From one perspective, from a faith perspective, of course, it's never bleak. But from one perspective, it is. Why? Because nearly 9 out of 10 Catholic children attend public schools. They're not getting a Catholic education. And a certain percentage of those children who are attending public schools go to religious education for an hour a week. Imagine, how much influence is that going to have against the onslaught of the culture that is every day for 12 years of their lives? So that's the future of the church, and they're not showing up. So this decline in religiosity is mirrored by a decline in moral values. So we can see as our kids are leaving the faith, their values are changing. So all those things that the church has traditionally taught as harmful to us as human beings, against God's law, but if it's against God's law, it's harmful to us. Those things go together. But all those things, contraception, same-sex marriage, premarital sex, these things are now deemed morally acceptable by the majority of Catholic adults. And this, of course, has impact on our culture. So what happened? Who do we point fingers at? Well, we shouldn't point fingers at anyone, but I will say that some of the fault seems to lie in how we have educated those younger generations and how we are continuing to educate them. For many of us, I'm sure people in this room had a really wonderful Catholic education, and that's what we hope for every child. And certainly the people I've known in Catholic schools who are teaching are dedicated people. But the vision isn't necessarily what it should be. So we've seen a decades-long failure to impart the faith to the next generation, which makes the task of all of you in this room who are educating the generation to follow, it makes that task all the more important. And really, I think we're at a turning point because of where the culture is. The culture is in just a place that is radically at odds with the truth. And part of that is because of the rise of gender ideology, which is an area, a topic that I spend a lot of time on, talking with parents, schools, priests, just trying to educate people. Because what's involved there is a clash of anthropologies. Our kids who are in public school, our Catholic kids, are absorbing a vision of the person that's radically at odds with everything our faith teaches. It's a fragmented vision. It's not a unity of body and soul, acknowledging a creator who created us male and female. It's a fragmented vision that they get to create themselves. It's the exaltation of self-determination. Auguste Comte, and I will tell you, I looked on the internet as to how to pronounce that because my husband jokes that if I pronounce something one way, it's surely pronounced a different way. So I listened to this French speaker pronouncing it, and I can't do it. So Auguste Comte, the father of positivism, once said, and I paraphrase, "To destroy something, you must replace it." So what's happening in our culture and in our schools is that the idea of freedom, the idea of who we are as a person is being replaced. A counterfeit vision is being substituted. But the idea of freedom is being replaced and transformed. The word is gutted of its meaning. So this Pope Benedict, while he was still Cardinal Ratzinger, described the displacement of true freedom with its counterfeit this way. He noted that freedom has become an almost magical word, as if it were the absolutely highest good, the good to which all other goods are subordinate. We're used to thinking, when we look back on the cultural changes of the past 40 years, we're used to referring to the sexual revolution, the gender revolution. The word revolution suggests that there's something sort of noble in it. But each of those movements started out with the word liberation. It was sexual liberation. It proposed an idea of freedom as the absence of restraint. No more God's laws, no more moral codes, but the person gets to decide. So we've seen sexual revolution, or sexual liberation, gay liberation, which some of you may be old enough to remember that was actually the first banner that the whole LGBT movement sort of marched under. It was gay liberation. Freedom, again, the absence of restraint. Women's liberation. Who's heard the phrase, trust women? What does that mean? It means women get to decide what's right. As long as women make a free choice, it must be right. I oftentimes go and debate at universities, and I was at one particular law school and debating a woman professor who had previously been an attorney for NARAL, one of the major pro-abortion organizations. And I walked through sort of a basic scientific thing about the humanity of the unborn child, and talked about why should we be stuck with 70s science when we're, in the 2017, 2018 at the time. And she admitted, she said, okay, it's human life. You'd think that would answer the question, right? It would tell you something about whether abortion should be legal or not. But then she said, but the question is, who decides? Who decides what happens to that life? And these kids in the class are nodding and cheering, and trust women. Let women decide. That is the counterfeit freedom. A freedom departing from truth, the truth about the person, the truth about what abortion is. We've seen this idea of freedom corrupted as well in other movements that have come since then. Queer liberation, and then now we have the gender revolution, or the transgender liberation. And ultimately, each one of these things comes down to the idea of self-determination, that we as human beings are these autonomous individuals. In other words, we sever our relationship with God. We no longer think of ourselves as fundamentally relational. From the moment you were conceived, you have been in relationship with God. And yet the prevailing anthropology and philosophy that's promoted in our public schools, or government schools if you prefer, is one that posits the human being as self-determining. There is no God. God's or at least go talk to your parents about it. But everything you learn is learned as if there were no God. God is absent from all those conversations, all those questions, all those discoveries about how the world works. God is not present, reinforcing to our kids who are in those schools that God's irrelevant to their lives, no matter if they go to church on Sunday or even pray with their families in the evening. When it comes to the important things, the things they need to learn to be a successful adult, God's not part of the conversation. They don't really need him. That's freedom. That's freedom. So, where does that leave us? It's the I decide. It's up to me. Pope Benedict, by the way, I forgot this quote. He said about abortion, he said, what kind of a freedom is it that declares it freedom to take away the freedom of another in terms of just another person's life? So that's in the culture. That's what our kids are exposed to. And I reinforce, and I won't give you the spiel on my book, but the book that my sister and I wrote is called, it's got a very timid title of Get Out Now, Why You Should Pull Your Child from Public School Before It's Too Late. But what prompted us to write that was seeing what was happening specifically in terms of gender ideology and this false vision of the person that was being proposed. And it's just shot through the schools, in spite of good people who are in the public schools. There are good teachers, good families, but it's being driven by litigation, it's being driven by the activist groups. Parents are not listened to, they're just not a factor. So that's one thing. If all we had to worry about was sort of what's out there in the culture, but surely we as a church have got it right? We're doing a great job educating our kids. Well, one of the problems is that in the church we're infected with that same false vision of freedom. Benedict said this. He said, modern man, for him, conscience stands on the side of subjectivity It's the expression of the freedom of the subject, of the person. So we tend to believe, and he's talking about that as being an erroneous point of view, that we tend to think conscience is just, it's my decision, it's my judgment, sort of in a vacuum. I get to decide. And he said, in that mindset, authority, on the other hand, appears to modern man as a constraint on, a threat to, and even a negation of freedom. What authority is he talking about here? Not just laws. He's talking about the authority of the church. So how many Catholics have no idea of the connection between the church's teaching authority and the formation of their conscience? We hear a lot about forming consciences, and conscience is inviolable. It's between you and God. But we have an obligation to form that conscience. And right now in the church, there's a lot of confusion about what your conscience is. Is it just your strongly held belief? And you get to hold it no matter what. Is the church just like your kind of nice, maybe eccentric uncle? You know, comes up with a good idea once in a while. You'll hear him out. But really, you don't have to follow what he says. You can pat him on the shoulder and say, thanks, uncle. And move on. You know, what is our relationship to the church and the church's authority? Put differently, what is our relationship to God? Do we see ourselves under the authority of God? Do we see our freedom as truly a freedom that helps us find happiness and fulfillment only when it's in conformity with God? Because God's our maker. He's the one who created us, gave us a human nature. He knows what's good for us. My dad used to use an example with some of his classes when he was trying to explain natural law and the creator. He would say, he'd pick someone out and say, do you have a car? They'd say, yeah, I got a car. He said, you own it, right? Yeah, I own it. You can do whatever you want with it. Yeah, I can do whatever I want with it. Can you put sand in the gas tank? Well, I could. Yeah, you know what? You're free to do that. You're free to do that. What happens if you put sand in the gas tank? You're a pedestrian. All right? Why? Because the car is made to run on gasoline. The maker designs it a certain way. So we cannot conceive of ourselves and fashion our own humanity and our own happiness without understanding who God made us to be. That's freedom in Christ. When we see that vision and we conform our lives to that, that's when that car drives. That's when we find human flourishing. So in the church, we do have a wonderful opportunity here, because I think with the culture having gotten so bad, I think parents are rethinking, what do we do? Every place I go, and I speak all across the country, every place I go, the heartache of people my generation is that their kids have left the faith. And they see their grandchildren not being baptized, not being sent to Catholic school, and they wonder, what can I do? And I say, pay their tuition. Send them to a Catholic school. They need that formation. They need to know who they are. So this Catholic vision of freedom is a beautiful one. It comes first from the fact that God made us in his image. We have free will. But Galatians tells us, for freedom, God has set us free. Stand fast and do not submit to the yoke of slavery, to sin, to our own desires, not in conformity with God. So freedom is in the service of the good. God is all good. That's the vision of Catholic education, that everything flows in that direction. So everything you learn over the next couple of days about particular subjects, about how to organize and start a school or fund it or any of the practical things, it's all subordinate to that vision of freedom in Christ. And that vision is a freeing vision. That's how you get your wings. That's how you find success. Because it's given to us by the Maker, by our Creator. And that's where we need to go. So freedom in the service of the good, in conformity with our human nature given by God. So what next? Well, the task of education is to educate every person in love first for Jesus Christ. Education is about who? It's about introducing our children and our teachers and their families to the Lord Jesus Christ. It's not a what, it's not an accumulation of knowledge. It's a who. That's where it begins. So the world, the youth, in particular young people, love this word freedom. They all want to be free. Their hearts are longing for true freedom because their hearts are longing for God. Their hearts are longing for what's true and what's good and what's beautiful because that's how God made us. But we have to tap into that. And so this renewal of Catholic education is not so much about buying new books. It's about the vision. It's about understanding our purpose, first of all, and getting the vision and the manner of teaching where God is woven into everything, not just an extra class that the kids end up taking, and everything else is sort of driven by public schools. And at one point I was on a diocesan school board, and lots of good people on it, but it was problematic because the benchmark for success was what's our competition doing? Our competition was the public school magnet school. It was the gifted and talented program in the neighborhood school. That was the competition. And all I can think of is, I remember hearing the story of St. Patrick, right? He went to Ireland, after he was freed, and he goes back to Ireland, and who did he begin to teach? He taught the king's children. He and his followers, they taught the children of the leaders. And I feel like we as Catholics have sort of turned it on its head. We've outsourced our most precious, legacy, our children. We've outsourced the education of our children to a secular system where God has no place. It's like flipping St. Patrick on its head. What do we expect is going to happen? The very same thing that St. Patrick was able to accomplish is what we're seeing. The secularized culture that offers a different counterfeit vision of freedom is having its way with our kids. It's pulling them out. Whereas before, when the culture was more in line with Christian principles, I like to think of it as sort of going down the lazy river, if you've ever been in those water parks. It sort of carries you along, generally in the right direction. That's not the way it is anymore. The culture is like a riptide, just pulling our kids out to sea, and they're floundering. They're in the wrong direction. So to change that is our task. And that's the wonderful task. With every difficulty comes an opportunity. And I look at the gender ideology thing, and that's just spreading everywhere, and I hear the stories from these just grieving parents who literally, they speak about losing their children to this cult of transgender ideology. And I look at that and I say, it's a horrible thing what's happening. But for the first time, I'm getting emails from school principals saying, we're looking for a course on Christian anthropology. We need to talk to kids about what it means to be a human being. We need to not just teach them the precepts of our faith, but to understand and have that relationship with God and to see the whole vision. So if there's a plus to all of this, it's that we're presented with a powerful opportunity to bring the truth, to bring freedom in Christ to all of our kids and their families. And that, I think, is the beautiful mission of what's going on here. The Institute for Catholic Liberal Education, and each one of you in your own places, you are that seed. You are the ones who can bring this vision to others. And when it catches on, it's going to spread. And again, it's not like just getting a new program. It's a vision. It's a way of being Catholic, a way of educating the person. So this is your opportunity. And I was struck by Elizabeth's comment in the video, and she said, Catholic education can change the world. Catholic educators can change the world. And therefore, Catholic education can change the world. And that's your task. So I'm thankful you're here. I'm so grateful for the Institute and for what all of you are doing. So keep it up, and I can't wait to see the results. I hope when I've got gray hair that's obvious, not just under, I'll see these wonderful, uptick in the numbers, and I'll know where it came from. That Catholic education has truly been the source of renewal for the Church. Thank you. So I guess there's time. I can take a couple of questions if anyone has any.
Yes. You say you have heard from your grandparents who are very unhappy about their grandchildren being this gender ideology. What do you hear from the parents? Because I'm not particularly seeing that. That's the way it is in public schools, and they just turn their eyes on it.
Yeah, so some parents are very troubled, the ones who are aware of what's going on. But one of the things that's happened is in these schools, they have specific regulations and policies that make it so they will not tell parents if their own child comes to school and is exhibiting gender confusion. And I've seen it in the regulations, I've seen it acted out, I've talked to parents for whom that's been true, I've talked to teachers who have seen it in action. They have watched kids struggling with this and been told they cannot say anything to the parents, to the families. And so what often happens, the tragic stories that I hear, are parents who are suddenly blindsided. Their child, and it's 4-to-1 girls now who are succumbing to this. It used to be more of a male problem, and now it's 4-to-1 young women. But all of a sudden they'll sort of come out to their parents, and then come out with conditions. And they'll say, I'm suicidal, I gotta get on the hormones. I need the cross-sex hormones. And if you don't support me, if you don't affirm me, I won't feel safe. And I'm gonna leave home, or I'm gonna cut off contact. And you wanna see broken-hearted parents? Every time I hear a certain Jesuit celebrating, where things are going with all of this, the gender stuff, I think, I really wish I could introduce you to some of the people I am talking to on a regular basis, because this is tragic. You live a lie, it creates harm. So in the public schools, there are some parents who are waking up, and there are some valiant groups of parents. There's one in Fairfax County where I live, California, Oregon, Michigan, who are trying to bring awareness to the problem and push back on the school board. But you know how much success they're having? 0. Because the school boards are no longer responsive to parents. And that's one of the things that has changed radically in the past 5 to 10 years. So, and the other thing I would say is this, we as Catholics, we have a heart for the poor and a heart for the immigrant. And I just am encountering more and more situations, especially Hispanic families, where they had no idea of what their kids were learning until their child confronts them. Just no idea, even though in some states where there are permission slips and things like that, oftentimes they don't get them in Spanish. They don't know. And talk about being brokenhearted, especially someone who perhaps might be undocumented. And what do they do? That is a real tragedy, and that's why, I think the answer has got to be that every child has got to have the opportunity for a Catholic education. And I remember talking to one bishop and saying, how are we going to do that? Everyone thinks, $10,000 tuition or whatever. We've got to be creative, and that's, I think, the beauty of something like this. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this. And so we have to bring that creativity to make it possible for every child to have a truly Catholic education. So.
I just had a question on that, because a lot of parents are asking, this is the first year, our parish school, most of the students are now going to go to the public high school because the pastor has said, don't go to the Catholic high schools in our area, they're bad. So I've been kind of directing them more towards the Christian. So I was just wondering, what advice would you give parents that they're being told it's actually worse to go to the Catholic high schools in the area? Do they go and try and change them? Because it's a battle.
So the reality is that there are a lot of different kinds of Catholic schools, right? We can see that in the situation in Indianapolis, where you had a Jesuit school that decided to treat a teacher who was in a same-sex marriage. They said, great, fine, you're welcome. And another school within the archdiocese, the diocese said, integrity. You are a witness, you are a model. If you are in a purported marriage with a same-sex partner, you cannot teach. Because it is immediately obvious to our children that you are rejecting something essential about our faith, which is the idea that sexual difference is real, and men and women are made for each other. And marriage is about that coming together of a man and a woman. And so it's a sign of contradiction, undercutting what the church is promoting. So you have to look at the Catholic school. Now, I would say any Catholic school is better than where the public schools are. I wouldn't always have said that, but I would say that now. And I would say the other factor, too, is that the Catholic schools have to be more responsive to parents than, for example, a public school. And, you have to raise it and you have to educate. I'm finding when I go to a particular diocese and talk about gender ideology, for example, and I talk to the teachers, all the teachers, it runs about 50-50, whether they're on board with the church's teaching. And not because there's ill will. It's because they don't know. And the general stats are on the Catholic population is that half of adult Catholics think if you're born a man, you really could become a woman. So that's just a reflection of the inadequacy or the false teaching that has occurred over the past few decades. So someone who's there, I figure, okay, this is an opportunity to educate, and you have to begin to do that. But you got to open those conversations. And Christian schools, it depends, because some Christian denominations and most of the secular private schools are all on board with this. It really depends on, how closely they hew to the biblical tradition and traditional morality. So you got to pray and you got to know your kid, too. Where are they going to be able to swim against the tide if that turns out to be the case, so, okay.
And Mary, I don't know if you remember me, but I actually met you at Cato Bird's home 11 years ago.
And your name?
Matt Meehan.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
Your father actually convinced me to become a teacher. Kate told me to call him. I couldn't decide between an LSAT and a GRE. And he said,
glad you did.
He said, do you think you could be a good teacher? I think so, yeah. We've got a lot of good lawyers. We need more good teachers.
And that's true. That's true. Yeah, great.
I wonder, my wife is from families from southern Indiana, and the public schools there, the nuns taught all the classes there. They were the teachers at the local public school. And those who weren't Catholic would break out with a pastor to do their religious ed or the rabbi.
Right.
Is there any hope of bringing God back into the public school system? It's such a huge infrastructure, and there's all this money and energy. Is that just a lost cause?
Let me put it this way, not within your child's lifetime. So I don't think we should give up on fighting, to change the direction of the public schools, because the reality is there are always going to be people who are going to be attending them. But we're a polarized society. Why? Because truth is real, and there are a lot of people who reject the truth. And so there's kind of no middle ground. And so we have competing visions of what's good, of what's true, of who the human person is. And right now, all the power and all the influence is on one side. And again, part of what's driving this is litigation. There's one particular LGBT law firm that has made it known that they will sue any school, including charter schools, in the country If there's a transgender child who's not allowed to use the appropriate facilities, to be on the sports team, to be called whatever name they want. And when you have small school districts and they get a letter threatening a lawsuit, they're thinking, do I have $1 million to fight a lawsuit? You know, and it becomes a no-brainer. They capitulate. And the problem is, it's not just about that kid. That changes everything. You can't opt out of culture. And this is in the culture of the schools now, in a way that even 5 years ago, it was not. So, again, what I say to parents is, you know, there are no do-overs on childhood. You get one shot. And so you need to look and see what your child needs and how you're going to give them that self-understanding, that basic understanding of who they are, which is so fundamentally distorted by all of this. So, anyway, but great to see you.
Thank you.